behind the scenes, it was a small group of people that were doing everything.
Welcome back to the GTM podcast. It's your host, Scott Barker.
I want to know how this insane growth actually happened.
Welcome back to the GTM pods. It feels like I haven't done one of these in a while. I've been on the road for a couple weeks. We've backlogged some of these. You don't know how it all happens behind the scenes, but hopefully I'm not too rusty because certainly excited for this next guest. Super humbled with the guest quality that we've had recently. We had Lisa Fink, Manny Medina, and now we have Elena Hutchison. Elena, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It's going to be a fun one, and always enjoy doing some pod prep, and there's so much to cover. But before we get there, super quick bio. So for listeners, Elena has over 15 years of B2B SaaS experience, including a 10-year run at Medallia, where she supported the company's growth from Series B through IPO. And as Medallia's Chief Strategy Officer, Elena led product marketing, Analyst Relations, and the PreSales function, and contributed significantly to the company's M&A and product strategy. Elena has other expertise in scaling global PreSales functions and joined Medallia as one of its first sales engineers and eventually led the 150-person org, which is a crazy trajectory. She has also built a reputation as an elite analyst relations practitioner, something we're going to dive into a little bit later, with multiple leading Forrester waves, Gartner MQs under her belt. And prior to Medallia, Elena spent 5 years in professional services and customer success roles. And what else am I missing? Who's Elena behind the scenes?
No, I think that's the stuff. And honestly, there was a lot of era where, and a lot of the Medallia era where Elena was just Medallia Elena doing work. I think over the last several years and my last couple of years at Medallia, I broadened who I am as a human a little bit. I have a 6-year-old, so she's obviously a big part of my life. I do animal rescue stuff. So I foster Labrador retrievers. I've always got a rotating cast of those coming through my house. And I think it's just I always struggle with my background because, like I said, I spent 10 years at the same company. It's a long time in tech. It's maybe an eternity in tech, and a lot of lessons in there for how do you keep it fresh over a long career at a single company. So I'm excited to talk.
Yeah, absolutely. And you also just got back from Vegas. Your husband was in the World Series of Poker Championship, which is pretty cool. We wish him luck.
Thank you. We do too. He's made it through day 1. He's got day 2 to go. He will die that we're talking about this on this podcast. But I spent the weekend in Vegas. I got to see Adele, which was amazing. Knock on wood that he plays well in his day 2.
Yes, we wish him the best of luck. Does Adele still have it? It must be such a strain on her voice.
It was unreal. Like I don't want to spoil anything, but they're like Set Fire to the Rain involves both fire and rain, and she's just an epic performance. It is impossible to go to that show and not cry a little. So amazing. It's amazing. She's there just on weekends. I think she's living her best life. Weeks at home, just 2 shows in Vegas every weekend. It's a phenomenal show.
I was going to say, because usually those Vegas shows, they do like 4 or 5, sometimes, 6 days a week. And I was like, with that level, the level of effort she gives in her voice, it would be so straining. So it's good to hear.
It would be impossible. Like she's living her right balanced life, which is a thing I'm trying to do right now as well. Like she's doing her thing, but on a limited basis, just in the way that serves her well. That's a little bit of an idol for my life at the moment.
Yeah, I love it. All right. So where to start? So obviously having a 10-year run is very unique at least in tech circles. So I do want to go into that. I also want to talk a lot about analyst relations, because I don't hear a lot of people talking about it, at least at the early stage right now. You had phenomenal results, which I want to go into. But let's start with the 10 years at Medallia, starting as a sales engineer, working your way up to the C-suite. What do you think now, looking back, allowed you to keep going, keep growing, keep progressing at the company while also staying personally motivated?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I look back on that 10 years, it feels like 5 different companies, at least. I mean, when I started, we'd just done a Series B. I was one of the first sales engineers, and they really didn't have like a professional sales function before that. They were bringing in some talented sellers who kind of came from the BMC Blade Logic coaching tree. And as a part of that, I think those folks had all grown up knowing the impact that sales engineers could have on sales cycles. And so they said, we got to get some sales engineers in here. Back then, and even now, you can't just pick up, the perfect sales engineer off the shelf, right? It's always sort of a mix of different roles. And my background was that I was in professional services or customer success for a competitor. So I had been helping companies. What Medallia does, if people aren't familiar, is customer experience. So I have been helping companies build those programs using my market research background to say, build it like this. Here's the best practices. Here's how you should do it. And I got this call one day from a recruiter who said, "Hey, there's this job, and you could take all that thought leadership that you have, all the things that you know, but instead of spending your day apologizing for stuff that broke and things that are kind of out of your hands, you're going to use it in the sales cycle to help these companies set up their programs for success." And the title at the time was sales engineer. I was a little allergic to that title. I certainly did not consider myself an engineer. I'm not super technical. I was a market researcher by training, and sales. I thought sales was, baseball games and restaurants and relationships and car salesman-y stuff, and I just had no appreciation at all for, kind of the art and science of selling. So I was really lucky to get pulled into that group of people and to be able to learn from who I consider some of the best enterprise sellers in the world, just how sales looks. And every step of my career has been like that. I took on analyst relations. There's a lot we can talk about why a sales engineer makes a lot of sense to take that on, but totally different thing. Usually fits in product marketing, but it's still all about tying product to what the buyer wants to achieve and really making that connection, right? Whether it's for one sales cycle or one to many. That's kind of been the common thread through my whole career. And I've been willing to say, yeah, sure, let me try that. And I'll figure it out from the sales engineering role, analyst relations, taking on product marketing, all the way through my career was, let me bet on myself. I'll probably be able to figure that out. And, if the company keeps growing, there is always new things to take on, new challenges that the business is going to see. So I was really lucky to get to see a whole bunch of different eras of Medallia through that journey.
Hmm. And how did you fill those gaps when you're, in, let's say, a sales engineering role and you're starting to take on these more responsibilities? Someone, gives you a promotion and says, "Hey, what about product marketing?" And then you have to learn this whole other function. And you did that multiple times. What did you lean on? Did you lean on peers mostly? Did you lean on internal mentors? Did you read every book?
All of those things. I read all the books. I mean, if there's one common thread through all of these things, it's heavy imposter syndrome when I get into these roles, right? I have no idea what I'm doing, which makes me very willing to study, to ask questions, to be naive about the answers. When I started as a sales engineer, I was not a very good public speaker. And so I went to Toastmasters. I was like, I got to master this. Like, this is the thing that's going to hold me back. I got to solve it. In product marketing, I still to this day know nothing about marketing, really. I mean, that's not true. I've learned a lot, but I was good at hiring. And so I ended up hiring an incredible product marketer who could work with me to shore up the gaps I didn't understand. And then I could work with her on the product side. So, I think it's all of those things. And then mentorship. I have had unreal mentors. Never formal. I'm not sure I really believe in formal mentorship. I mean, I do it to some extent, but I think the informal mentors who, whether it's a boss or someone nearby who takes an interest in your career and says, you know what, I think you could do this next great thing. When I look back over the history of my career, there are a number of people who make a bet on me and advocate for me to take that next step. And then I always felt very driven to pay that back and to do well. So I was willing to make that call to a mentor or to a peer or read that book or whatever it took. And a lot of just like screwing it up and figuring it out, right? I think I figured out pretty early what stuff I could play around with and A/B test and what stuff was really, really critical. Analyst relations, like a waiver and MQ being in that second bucket where you can't screw it up, right? So you have to be willing to raise your hand and say, hey, help, like we're in trouble and we need to get in the boat to solve it, whatever the problem might be. So, I think it was all of those things. I think it comes from humility, right? I've never had the joy of stepping into a role and feeling like I've got this. I know completely how to do this. And I think probably given the way my career path went, I never will.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel that way every day of, of my life, that it feels like the first inning every day. I'm learning new things every day.
But doesn't that
And
make it
I
fun? I
hope
mean,
it
that's how
does.
you stay for 10 years, right? When you
Yeah.
enjoy the subject, I enjoyed our customers, I enjoyed my peers, but like the job kept fresh. And this is always the advice I give people. Like if you are continuing to learn in a place and the company feels like they're investing in you and you're growing and the company is growing, because you can get stuck in a place where the company is kind of stagnating too. But if someone's investing in you and you continue to learn, like you're so much better off staying 90% of the time than you are hopping to a different place for a title. Because you're a known quantity and that gives you a lot of freedom to write the role that fits your skills the best.
Yeah. Totally. What's the Naval quote that's my favorite? All of the good things in life, all the returns in life, uh, life, knowledge, and relationships come from compound interest, and so you need to, build those, and it takes time, and people will continue to invest in you over time, and you start to see the fruits of that. Also, shout out Toastmasters. We have that in common. I still remember the meeting as a young business development manager where I had to get in front of the whole company and my voice just started shaking uncontrollably. And up until that point, I thought I was a great public speaker. And then I learned like there's like physical symptoms that can take control if you're not practicing it. So I went to Toastmasters as well. I think
I had to work
every
through the same thing. I couldn't stop the physical symptoms. I was like, I feel confident, I'm prepared. And to this day, like I sort of, if I'm going into a big meeting or something like that, I always do the same outline process. Like no matter how senior I got, the things that worked for me then, the tools that I learned then, they still serve me now. And you figure out a process that works for you to manage, whatever it is that you're struggling through. But I had to struggle through that. It was not comfortable, but I never would have had the success that I did if I hadn't. The other thing I did quite frequently is gamify stuff. So like one challenge I had, particularly growing up as a woman in a sales org, I tended to take a back seat and let other people speak in meetings. And that got to a point in my career where I really needed to be the one speaking. I was going to have the smartest thing to say if I could convince myself to say it. And so I started just making bets with peers, like I will talk on this call and, and hold me accountable if I don't do it. And, I think having those little things that would just force me to do the things I knew I needed to do always helped me get through them.
I love that. What was the biggest bet that you made? We talking $5 bets? These $50 bets?
No, never mind. It was always just like like the shame of not fulfilling that. Like if I say I'm going to do something, I am going to do the thing, and I am not going to always bragging rights. And I never lost one of those bets. If I said I was going to do something, I was talking on that call.
I love
Somehow.
that. I love that. Okay, so I think this question is going to take us a nice segue into kind of analyst relations. And you said something about believing sales engineers would make great AR folks, people to lead that initiative. Why do you think that is? Would love to hear the understanding behind that.
No, I think it's analyst relations. My whole career is like me doing things that I had never heard of before I'm doing them. And analyst relations is a great example of that. I mean, Medallia in 2011, when we did our Series B, Forrester had just come out with a wave of our space. It was the first wave of the space, covered the vendor I worked with at the time, and Medallia did very, very well in it. And I think everybody at the company kind of attributed at least some of the success that Medallia was seeing in that raise and in the market to the fact that Forrester had blessed, this is a good product that you should be looking at. So we all knew that a Forrester wave or Gartner Magic Quadrants kind of work the same way. This is a key moment. It's going to tell the market you should believe in this or you shouldn't. And Medallia, the leadership at the time, my boss, a woman named Elizabeth Carducci, who was the first employee of the company. Medallia was founded by a husband and wife team, and but Elizabeth was the first external employee, if you will, very much a founder. And she looked around and she said, "Who can do this?" Right? She had done the 2011 wave, and what she realized doing that wave is that a wave or an MQ, it looks a lot like a sales cycle, right? There's a moment where you have an opportunity to hopefully influence the criteria the analyst is thinking about. Then there's a big questionnaire, looks a lot like an RFP. Then there's a big kind of dog and pony show moment where you are, it's basically like a pitch, but you're giving a briefing, telling what your company strategy is, giving a big demo. There's references. You can coach them and train them and hopefully, help them understand how to show well for you, and picking the right ones is a big part of it as well. And then hopefully, if you've done it right, you get this beautiful piece of collateral that, in my opinion, becomes, it is the most important sales cycle you run for the 18 months to 2 years that piece of collateral exists. You use it everywhere, right? And we had been using that 2011 wave everywhere. So when the next wave came up in, I think it was must have been 2016, because I was pregnant at the time. I had been leading the a sales engineering territory, but I needed to get off the road. And Elizabeth, to her credit, kind of looked around and said, we need an SC who can do this, because an SC knows how to influence criteria, answer a questionnaire in a strategic way that will show us well, do the big dog and pony show, manage the references, all of that stuff. And so, she was one, this is a great example of her mentorship and leaning into, Elena can do this. She's never done it before, but she'll figure it out. And I never got away from it after that. Analyst Relations was kind of the gateway for me into doing product marketing, into the executive team role that I ended up in. It's Analyst Relations done right, but I see it done poorly sometimes, where it's kind of a part of PR, right? There's public relations, and then Analyst Relations is just public relations for analysts, right? That is the wrong way to think about it. Analysts are talking to buyers all the time about what they're interested in, what problems they're solving, what gaps there are in the technologies in the market. They have a really good sense of buyers, and they're incredibly valuable sources of information, and buyers listen to them. Now it's changing some. I mean, you've got G2 Crowd and Trustpilot and some other things that are coming into the space and maybe threatening in some ways to disrupt the Gartners and the Forresters in the world. But you will not convince me that big enterprises, which is who I've sold to primarily, are anywhere close to getting away from that third-party vouching for strong technologies. If you're buying, multi-million-dollar contracts that touch a lot of parts of the business, you want that third party to say, this company's stable, they have customer references that are good, like we've looked at them. You need that to protect, to really defend the decision that you're going to be making. And so how the analysts view you at that level starts to get really important. But you can't just show up when you're ready for an analyst to cover you well and say, okay, I'm here, cover me well. Analyst Relations is a long game. And so one of the mistakes I think I sometimes see founders making now is thinking, it's really not time to engage in that until there is a wave or an MQ. Like the time to get involved is when you're starting to have product market fit. You're starting to have a really good sense of, who am I in this market and who am I not? And you feel like you can convey that with good customer stories, right? So if you can go to a Forrester or a Gartner, or there's lots of other ones out there, who is talking to your potential buyer and talking to them about the problems that you solve, and you've got good customer stories that show that you have momentum in the market and that people are choosing you. Ideally, stories where you're replacing an incumbent who maybe that analyst is covering. That's the moment, because that's when you can start to get in with that analyst and say, hey, we're seeing a different way, a better way, a wedge in this space of doing things a little bit differently. Are you hearing the same thing? And then you can start to get that analyst saying to the right customers, to the right buyers who are saying the right words, you should think about this other company. There's this other company that's kind of doing something interesting along the lines of what you just said. And you can actually turn analysts into champions who are selling on your behalf. You can do that before you get into a wave or an MQ. And I think not enough, it's not a thing you do at seed stage, but once you're getting into A and B and you're starting to have that traction, that's the time to start to engage.
There was a lot of nuggets in there. And I guess maybe just taking a step back, just for maybe first-time founders, maybe non-executives that are listening to this podcast. Do you have a definition of what analyst relations is and what they own fully?
Yeah, sure. So it's interesting. I haven't thought about defining it, but typically when people think about analyst relations, they think about Forrester and Gartner, who maybe IDC comes into that list, like these big third-party firms. They're filled up with thought leaders who write for specific audiences about all kinds of things, typically best practices. I'm sure much ink is being spilled at both Gartner and Forrester right now about generative AI. What's it going to do in the market? How should we all be reacting to this? And companies read that to make sure that they're staying ahead on trends, that they know what kind of the latest and greatest is. And one of the things these firms do is, waves and MQs and like market evaluations where they actually look at vendors. But it's not the only thing that they do. You can work with, and in fact, this is a great thing to do if you're earlier stage. You can work with Forrester, Gartner. Yeah, Forrester is a better example of this. IDC does it too, and some other analyst firms to actually validate customer references. Right, come in, speak with a couple of references, write a report about, for example, the ROI that someone might get from working with us. And that's a great way to, number one, get some great collateral that is blessed by a third party. So it's extra credible. It's not you putting out a case study. It's Forrester saying, we talked to one of Medallia's customers, and here are 6 of Medallia's customers or whatever it is. And here's what they said. So you get this piece of content that shows you really well. And it's got this third party kind of blessing on it. So that's why people care about this, because analysts are speaking to customers, they're making recommendations, and they're incredibly credible.
And would you bucket now kind of this new wave of like review sites and G2 and Trust Radius in that same bucket, or would someone else own that?
I think I think you should. I don't see a lot of companies doing this yet, but I think Analyst Relations has the right strategic thinking to own that as well. And I'll give an example. We had a competitor who was doing really well it was G2 Crowd. G2, because part of the way G2 ranks is just volume of responses. Medallia was selling to big enterprises. We had fewer customers. This competitor had lots and lots of customers, but the vast majority of them were not relevant to the segment where we were selling. And so I think product marketing had tried owning this problem. Product had owned this problem. We were all seeing this bad graphic. They gave it to me, and I said, well, if I go to the ombuds person at this analyst firm and I explained to them that the way they're looking at our 2 companies really doesn't make sense, and there actually should be the vast majority of this other vendor's reviews should be in a different category where it doesn't affect us. That moved the needle for us, because all of a sudden we had taken 2/3 of this analyst or of this company's reviews away, put them in a different category where we didn't play, and suddenly we were showing really well. That's analyst relations strategy, right? I love product marketers, but probably product marketers not going to come in with that competitive spirit and say, how can I like box a bunch of these reviews just out of this evaluation entirely? And so, yes, I think, G2 strategy, all of those like third-party review sites, I think should be a part of your overall analyst relations strategy, which probably at the sizes we're talking about those with product marketing, that's pretty typical. But I think if your goal is just like, oh, let me drive some reviews somewhere, you're not thinking enough about it. The question of which site do we drive them to? The question of are we in the right category? When you start to get bigger, you have to start to think about Gartner Peer Insights, which is another site of those. It's not as popular, but if you get into a Magic Quadrant, that's the site that they use for reviews. And so suddenly that becomes a much more important part of the strategy. So, I think a lot of companies think about just getting some reviews somewhere. I think there's a lot of opportunity to think strategically about how is this company framing our category? Could we push on that a little bit? And then where should we be pushing review traffic to make the most impact on sales, which is ultimately the goal.
And I do want to highlight something that you said a little bit earlier about, engaging these analysts to do like ROI impact reports. I know at my time at Outreach, I think the number's still burned in my head. We did a Forrester ROI impact report. I think it was like 386% ROI. And it was Forrester telling the market that. And like, that was in every email signature. That was just like absolutely everywhere. And it became a tool for us for 2.5 years, I think, and it was brought up in every sales call. So like the impact of engaging them in that capacity as well is extremely powerful.
It makes a huge difference. And the other thing that you're doing when you do that is you're actually educating an analyst too, right? You can negotiate when you contract with Forrester, IDC, or whoever, that the person who would be covering your space is involved with those interviews. And so you get this opportunity to have them hear a bunch of really happy customer references in a row, which helps shape how they recommend you in the market. So there's a lot of ways to use that. We did a TEI report as well at Medallia. It was actually a big part of our S1 when we went public. And I had this incredible moment. I'd been at Medallia a while. We went public in 2019. So I'd been at the company for 7 years when we went public. But I actually got invited to stand up on the balcony when we had that IPO moment, which was just like an unreal, like a life goal that I never would have imagined having. And the night before we had a dinner, kind of a deal dinner, like a celebration sort of dinner. And Doug Leone from Sequoia Capital, like I got introduced to him, and somebody said, "Oh, this is Elena. She does the the Forrester stuff, I think was probably the sentence at that point. And he looked at me in the eye and he said, those things that you do, the wave and the TEI report and like the impact that you've had with this function, it's created $500 million in the value of this IPO. And it was just like a goosebumps moment because, I think we don't appreciate it enough. But when you think about influencing that person who's going to talk to every single buyer who's downloading that wave or downloading that report, going to be in everybody's email signature, all of those things, it becomes a really important part of your brand identity. And you can impact it by being smart about how you think about these things, and being a little bit better than some of the other than your competitors who are just going to say, give it to product marketing. They just need to fill out a questionnaire or whatever.
Yeah. And if everyone didn't just like sit up in their chair or whatever they're doing, get more alert when they heard $500 million in enterprise value from Analyst Relations, you gotta check your pulse because that's incredible. And yeah, that's really cool. And so how does this all work behind the scenes, right? There's this idea of people who are somewhat familiar with AR, but not too much, that it's like a pay to play thing and you got to give them a bunch of money and it's all just you buy your seat or whatever. How's it all actually working behind the scenes? What are some good goals to measure your team against? How do you originally start engaging these analysts? Maybe you have no relationships. Do I just cold call, Forrester or send them an email? How does it work behind the scenes?
So, the pay to play thing is people always say it. They always are kind of rolling their eyes when they talk about it. Analyst Relations is not pay to play in the strictest sense, right? I heard people say, oh, we'll never beat SAP at that because they spend so much money with Forrester or Gartner or whoever. That's not how it works. Paying for subscription licenses where you get access to an analyst certainly helps, right? If you have a seat license, that allows you to call an analyst and get their feedback and have them look at documents and say, what do you think about this positioning? Or what are you hearing in the market? It's super useful. And having that proximity can help you influence them, right? Because the more you're engaging with an analyst, the more opportunities you have to shift your framing or shift your go-to-market, or you have an opportunity to sound more like what they're expecting a winner in this market to sound like. So it's helpful, but it is not necessary. You can absolutely brief Forrester or Gartner without having a seat license. And I would recommend doing that when you start to feel like you have the traction we talked about before. We're starting to have product market fit. You just fill out a form on Gartner or Forrester's website and you say, hey, I'd like to brief an analyst. Here's the analyst that I think makes the most sense. And then you need to have a really compelling reason why that analyst should be talking to you. So it probably sounds something like, we are also selling into X space that you cover. We're coming up against Y competitors who you've written about before. We're finding that the market is really resonating with Z thing we offer, which is a new and different thing. And here's a metric that shows that. Could we come show it to you? And, a lot of their job is to sound and be credible about the space. So if you make a good pitch in that request, they will accept that because you're offering to educate them about the market and where it's going and what the next big thing is going to be. And that's what they want to know. They want to meet your customers. They want to understand references. They want their finger on the pulse of where the space is going. And so if you have that to offer, which as a startup who's disrupting something, you do, you are likely going to get some traction by reaching out to the right analyst. What I wouldn't do is reach out to 20 analysts and say, hey, don't you all want to hear this pitch? The first thing you need to have clear is, who am I? Who am I trying to be? What is the sentence I want to come out of this analyst's mouth when they are talking to a customer? Company X is great for people who have Y problem and Z infrastructure, right? If I can get them saying that, then they're going to, and I've gotten leads from analysts who, specifically were talking to a prospect. They said the right things. It resonated with something we had planted in their brain about who we were. Then all of a sudden I'm getting an email from an analyst or a warm intro from an analyst. Hey, it feels like you guys should talk. That's incredible. And that's the right goal for early stage. It's not a wave or an MQ. It could be something like a Gartner cool vendor. Some of these analyst firms have like earlier stage coverage items that you can play for. But I think the real goal is building an early stage champion and getting a little bit of feedback. You get better feedback once you're paying for Gartner or Forrester services because then they'll meet with you and talk to you. But if you give a briefing, a lot of times you can get a feel for how the analyst reacted to it in the moment, and that's super valuable.
So good. So, we have to be super solid on who am I, what am I trying to be in the market? And then your goal is to leave them with the idea what's the one sentence that they can articulate to the market on our behalf when they're thinking about Medallia or company X. That's really what it's all about at the super early stage. And then what were you kind of like metriced on? Was it just strictly like where you placed in the,
I mean, from
you
an
know,
analyst relations, I think
yeah.
for a lot of AR programs that metric themselves in things like number of meetings, how many analysts did we engage with? Like, we always led a sales forward AR program. The goal was not meetings. The goal was not even really insight, although you can get some great insight and kind of messaging stuff from analysts as well. Our goal was do all the things that will help us sell. So get an analyst who is champion, behaving like a champion for us. Optimize review sites so that we can use those in sales cycles. Obviously, waves and MQs are the 10,000-pound gorilla when it comes to that. But we were all, and TEI reports, ROI types of reports as well. We were always thinking, how can we use this very credible third party to help sales cycles go faster, drive leads, just to help smooth every part of the sales process. But other people look at it differently.
Yeah. Well, that was incredibly, incredibly valuable. And if there is a sales engineer on the call that looks around and you're at a company that's Series A, Series B, and no one is taking ownership over analyst relations, I think you can take that last 20 minutes and hopefully go stand up the beginnings of a program.
I love it. Yeah, call product marketing and say, hey, I'd love to help. I just love to get involved. They always need, here's the other thing about a sales engineer doing those demos and briefings. Analysts love to hear from somebody who's actually in the market, right? If you're a product marketer just giving like the basic pitch, that's not super compelling. As a sales engineer, when you're giving a demo and an analyst asks a question, you can say, oh, I was just meeting with a company last week and they asked me that same thing, or they asked me this slightly different flavor of it. It's incredibly valuable for them because they're writing and speaking to an audience of buyers. And so if you can get real sellers in front of them, and sales engineers are perfect because they're in the technical weeds, but they know the customer stories and the success stuff. They're phenomenal at that. So yeah, I think any sales engineer who's listening, if you don't know who's running that at your company, go find your head of product marketing and talk about it.
All right, switching gears a little bit. So, you have this moment where, you get told you drove $500 million in enterprise value. You make it to the C-suite. You're the chief strategy officer. You obviously did an incredible amount of things right. Where did you go wrong, or what would you maybe do differently looking back?
Gosh, I mean, I think the biggest, there's so many mistakes. Like I've made mistakes in hiring. I've made mistakes in not turning over people. I've made mistakes in how I've led people. The biggest personal mistake that I made was taking on too much and letting myself burn out. And I think for me, there was this moment, and it was right as I kind of got to this C-suite level where my career had to shift from my 20s and 30s where I would, or early 30s, where I was very much like in a zone of yes. Yes, you need somebody to figure out analyst relations. Sure, I'll figure it out. You need somebody to run the SC team. Absolutely, I'm there. I don't know how to do that, but I'm confident that I'll put in the work and like figure it out. I got myself into a situation where I was leading a 140-person sales engineering team, still directly owning analyst relations. So if we had a wave or an MQ or something, like I was driving it. And I was also rebuilding product marketing at the time directly. And that was too many things. And it got me to a point where, I was just burnt out. I basically went to my leadership and said, look, like I got to go. This can't work. And thankfully, everybody leaned in and we restructured things. We got me the headcount that I needed so that I could step out of some of the day-to-day management of those things. And I think of it as stepping from like an era of yes, I'll be the person, I'll get it done, and stepping into an era of no, where, I really start to realize like a well-curated to-do list, being willing to say, no, we can't, my priorities for this quarter are A, B, and C. If you want D to be one of them, A, B, or C has to go because it's not fair to me and it's not fair to my team to take all those things on. And I'm here to tell you what the most important things are to work on. And I think they're A, B, and C. Here's why. And until I got comfortable having that conversation and saying, like the right thing for me, the right thing for my function, the right thing for my team is to focus here. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let's talk through it. I was just going to keep myself in a position where I adding on more and burnt out not just myself but my team, because when you're a leader and you set that example for people, you are also not setting the right expectations for people who are following you. And so it was a big lesson for me. I let it get way too far. Thankfully, we were able to kind of dial it back and get my role to a place where it was much more manageable, so that I could have one more act at Medallia. But yeah, it was a lesson that I debate, like, if I had learned it earlier, would I have had as much success as I had, or had taken on as many things and learned as many things? I'm not sure. As raising a 6-year-old and thinking about what advice would I give her about that era, I'm not sure, because I think in your 20s and 30s, like in the early part of your career, it's an amazing time to take on too much while you can. But there's a point at which that stops.
Yeah, it's certainly a double-edged sword, and you need to figure out when that period is that you have to make that transition before it's sometimes too late. And what helped you make that transition, do you think?
So it's very funny. I was feeling very burnt out, and I actually saw a Facebook ad for this women's coaching group, and I got involved with them, and it gave me, not for the first time, because I'd had mentors and I had peers, I had amazing people investing in my career, but I hadn't had a set of peer women at different companies who were not invested in the actual problems I were solving, but like could act as a mirror and say, "Hey, you seem really burnt out. Have you thought about what would happen if you just said no to this thing? You can't take on that project." And having that peer group who was and it was an amazing organization. It's called Corporate Women Unleashed, Corporate Women Refined. I forget what they call it these days, but having that peer group of women to hold me accountable to say, you know what, like, let's help you become a more whole person. Let's invest in some stuff that's not work. That's what made me strong enough to say, hey, you know what, I totally trust myself to push back, create boundaries, have a life a little. So I needed that. I needed that peer group kind of holding up the mirror for me.
Yeah. That's great. And that's great advice. Just looking for mentors outside of just internal mentors. Internal mentors can
Yeah,
be
somebody
extremely
you have to
helpful.
be real with, right? And internal mentors you politic with too. I mean, they have their own goals. They have you have to show up in a certain way for people you work with, regardless. If you can find people who are peers outside, who you can really, not competitors, not people who are rooting for you, who you can really be real and vulnerable with, there's so much growth in that direction. And I would consider all of those women to be strong mentors.
Couldn't agree more. All right. As we sort of wrap up, got 3 rapid fire questions for you. One is a founder question. And I know you'll have a strong opinion on this one because you started your career as a sales engineer, and that's specifically why I picked it out. At what point should we put resources into building a sales engineering team? During this market, it almost feels like a nice to have.
The nice to have, just like that, hurts my heart. I don't think it's a nice to have. The way I always ran sales cycles as an individual contributor, and then when I was hiring sales engineers, there's a credibility gap, right? When you're a seller and you're in front of a prospect, a buyer, they believe, I don't know, 50% of what you say. You bring in somebody who has technical expertise and business expertise and works with a whole bunch of customers who are trying to do the thing that this prospect is trying to do. They are much more credible, especially if you can change don't call them sales engineers. We changed the title to solution consultant, got sales and engineering both out of it, which felt much more comfortable for me. But I think at that point, that person is 80% to 90% credible. So what would you do? What is the value in your sales cycles of getting another person in the room who can tell customer stories, get people excited, paint a vision, make sure you're scoping things correctly so that they're actually going to get stood up to be successful. It's an investment in good customer stories. Ultimately it's an investment in customer success as well, because programs that have a good sales engineer who understands technical limitations and can work around, our product doesn't do that exactly the way you want, but it can do it in this other way, and that's going to be much more sustainable for our professional services or whoever. I think it's an investment in a lot more than just the deal. Now, if you have a product led strategy and the product speaks for itself, and your AEs or sales directors can demo it, and you're finding that they're perfectly credible when they do that, and they're reporting back to product what they're hearing in the market works and what they're hearing in the market are gaps. If all that stuff is happening, and maybe you don't need a sales engineer. Not every company does, but if you're at enterprise levels of complexity, if your sales cycles involve a lot of different potential champions and coaches to map to, having that person who is incredibly credible, deep in the technology, but also able to sell, I think SCs are invaluable.
Is there like a benchmark ratio these days for like, AEs to solutions consultants?
We always operated in a like 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 4 range, depending on the size of the business, or whether it was enterprise or mid market. I'm hearing things now like companies trying 1 to 5, 1 to 7, 1 to 10, even. I think at a certain point, and the other thing I'm hearing a fair amount of is actually involving the sales engineers in customer success. So actually giving sales engineers in some cases like a customer success remit where they actually own a book of business and they're trying to renew and upsell and all of those things, which I think is interesting because that gives that SC more credibility when they're in front of a customer to say, oh, I'm working with this other company and here's what they did and here's the value that they got out of it. So I think that's a really interesting model as well. Ultimately, like you need to understand what your SCs are working on. If you do it right, your SCs become a very valuable source of a good forecast, like a forecast check. An SC who's in those meetings can tell you if they think a deal is likely to close or if it isn't. And they probably have a better sense of that than that, they don't get happy ears in the same way. So I think, you want to fill up one's time and then see if it makes sense to invest in a second. And one thing I would recommend if you're just starting out with sales engineers, we hired 6 when Medallia first started. 2 came from professional services. So they were people who really knew the Medallia product well. 2 were professional sales engineers, kind of came from that Blade Logic BMC coaching tree. 2 were like me and came from the space and really knew the best practices. If you only have room for one, I would mine your professional services organization. And PS leaders, close your ears because I always got in trouble for doing this. But there's amazing talent in professional services or customer success somewhere over there working with customers who is open to this career shift where they become a seller and you feel like they can operate in a sales environment. They can live with the ambiguity that is inherent in sales. They can play the team sport of sales. There are leaps that person has to make, but you can potentially offer a high performer who's in a PS role a huge career boost by moving them into a sales engineering role. And for the right persona and the right person in your team, it might be a really logical thing to say, professional services person who's great, we'd love to have you help out with sales cycles 10 or 15 or 20% of the time. And then you can start to see whether you get better momentum out of those.
That's great advice. I also love the CS model that you talked about for solutions consultant. I could see that working really well. Just giving them new, fresh sound bites, which would be super helpful. Okay, final question. I'm going to scrap the last one, but I want to make sure I squeeze this one in. What's one thing that sales leaders or founders believe that you think is bullshit or no longer serving us?
Well, I know we are going to disagree on this one, or I suspect we are going to disagree on this one, but I have worked remotely for 15 plus years, not just in my 10 years at Medallia, but for 5 years before that at another company. And I cannot get my head around the return to office trend that tech is doing right now. Like if you're little and you can have everybody in a physical space together, I get it. I think it makes some sense then to have everybody, certainly you get speed out of that and you can ramp people very quickly. But I think a lot of the return to office trend we're seeing right now is a couple of things. One, companies not investing in onboarding the way that they should have, assuming that somebody can onboard via Slack just as efficiently as they could have in an office, which is obviously not the case. You have to be intentional about how you train people, how you connect people, how you make sure that they build those routes. And not enough companies have. And then for really big companies where they're not all in a place, like maybe this will be a spicy take, but like I think they're stealth layoffs. Like when you ask people to come back to an office and it's just to be on Zoom in the office, I'm not sure there's a ROI justification for why we should all be together in a physical place on Zoom. But I'm sure that's a spicy take. I know tech right now we're big into we're going to be in offices again. I'm very curious to see what that's going to look like 6 months or a year from now.
Yeah, I like the spicy takes. Always like them. It should get some good comments flowing from the podcast. Everyone's got a point of view. I worked remotely for the last 8 years. Was a huge proponent of remote, and this is the first time as we're growing a small local team. We've got an office, and we're asking people to come, into the office. We started with hybrid. We're likely going to move to more full time. So my views are kind of shifting, but I hear exactly what you're saying. I think part of it is, yeah, like an easier way to control speed, culture, and ramp time without investing a ton of time up front. So if you have the resources, and you should, for onboarding and enablement, especially at these big companies that do, don't go through corners there. So
I think if you're creating hybrid in any way, you are creating a bad work experience. Like, let's just, if you can do it where everybody's in an office and you do not have people coming to an office and then sitting on a Zoom with a different office, fine. I'll buy that there are, the lunchroom thing and the sitting down to have an async, like there is something to that. And remote first companies cannot skip that step. You need to bring people to a place so that they have relationships. Like, you still have to do those things. But the minute you have some people remote, everyone is in a hybrid situation. And, just as a caregiver, there are lots of groups of humans, including people who don't live in the major tech centers, who are amazing hires, incredible employees. They don't fit into an in-office culture. And I think, it's a decision to hire fewer of those people when you concentrate in a specific area. For me, looking at my career and who I've been able to hire outside of those bounds, it's not worth it. Plus, you don't have to pay for office space. There are so many advantages. So I'm fascinated to watch.
there's a lot. Well, but yeah, and it's also interesting that you kind of alluded to it of when we all know the pendulum swings in like employee, and then it goes to employer, and then employee, kind of this power struggle. So it will swing back more to employee, and if you're left with these hardline rules, you're going to miss out on
I
so
would
much
not
talent.
be signing 10-year leases right now.
Yeah. No. Don't do that. Don't do that. Amazing. Well, Elena, thank you so much for spending the time, sharing your story, sharing so much great advice. I know you're on sabbatical right now, but if people want to get in touch with you, learn more about what you're doing, I know you're doing some advising and consulting a little bit around some of the stuff that we talked about on this with AR relations. How can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I am doing some consulting around AR, specifically working with earlier stage startups who are hoping to maybe not invest a full-time employee, but still want to get some of the benefits of doing good planning around analyst relations. Folks can find me at uprightar.com. That's like up and to the right, AR. And so find me there. I've been doing a blog about AR and trying to focus it on startups and getting started in some of the earlier stage stuff. I'm also working with a number of companies who have found themselves in a wave or an MQ and really want to optimize their position in that. So those are kind of my two sweet spots. And then if analyst relations is not something you're interested in, just find me on LinkedIn. It's Elena Hutchison, not Hutchinson, which happens all the time. And yeah, I'd love to connect.
Perfect. Amazing. Well, thank you again, Elena. And thank you all for listening. I hope you found that as valuable as I did. And go check out the GTM newsletter. We usually go deeper on subject matter in the podcast. So I think you've inspired me to go put one together for analyst relations. There's a lot of meat on that bone. I think that would be fun to talk about. And we'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone.